activity of interpersonal features. Interpersonal, I mean the kind of social features of casual conversation. A lot of the work that's going on in casual conversation is not simply giving information. It's creating empathy. It's building social harmony, etc. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on that's supporting the small culture of the conversation. We'll look at some examples in a minute. And finally, what is called contingency. And by contingency, I literally mean connectedness. That spoken language is very connected in two ways. It's connected to the context in which you're speaking in, typically, so you can point to things, you can address it. And it's also connected very closely. Each utterance, each turn is very closely connected to the preceding utterance. And we signal those connections by using things like discourse markers. So let's have a look in more detail at some of the features of spontaneity using these examples. And things I call disfluencies is when we are not 100% fluent because we're speaking and planning at the same time. We'll come back to this list, but let's look at some examples of disfluencies. We've talked about this already when we repeat things, when we fill pauses with whatever. Yeah. And a lot of these, of course, we do. None of these are unique to English, by the way.
All the languages.
All languages. We all have the same problem when we're speaking. We have to speak and plan at the same time. So we have different ways, though, in different languages of filling these pauses. And so one of the things that maybe learners have to learn is how, if they want to sound more English-like, is to how to fill pauses in an English kind of way, which is not something necessary that's taught. I remember actually when I first arrived in Egypt, what's a very common pause filler in Arabic? Yani, exactly. So I arrived in Egypt with a friend. We arrived to teach in English. She was called Jane. The school lawyer, who was called Mr. Niazi, picked us up at the airport. He took us to the pizzeria in the Hilton on our first day. So Mr. Niazi's talking to us beautiful English, but every second we were saying Yani, so we'll take you to your flat, Yani, and then we'll do this Yani. And eventually my friend Jane said to him, "Excuse me, Mr. Niazi, my name is Jane, not Yani." So you know. So that was a case of him using pause fillers from Arabic in English and creating a slight confusion there. False start somewhere on this country road, etc. We correct ourselves as we go along. Those are signs of disfluency. And then there's this feature of spoken language which is sometimes called local assembly. That is to say, speech is assembled in small local, not global. It's not like when you're writing, you can kind of plan the whole thing in advance. You're speaking and you're assembling it locally, and this has an effect grammatically in the sense that a lot of it, if we could listen to these dialogues, we'd see that they would probably sound like this. She said that, looming out of the darkness, this figure just loomed out of the darkness in the middle of nowhere and put a tarpaulin over a cloud, didn't say anything. So it's broken up into these clause length or even sub-clause length units. It's not fully grammatically, syntactically, beautifully composed sentences. We do not speak in fully composed. Most of us don't. David Crystal does, but most people don't. And then another feature of spontaneity is that there's not a lot of subordination. That is to say, we don't use a lot of subordinate clauses. The syntax is relatively simple. There's a lot of coordination where these phrasal chunks are joined by common conjunctions like but and. She has corrugated iron, but it fell through the ceiling and landed in her lap. But then here is a subordinate clause of time when she was sitting watching television. So she got really scared and she stopped and she pulled over to the side. There are lots of ands, lots of buts, lots of so's. In fact, those are the three conjunctions that you all really need, maybe them as well, in spoken language. You do not say however, moreover, nonetheless, notwithstanding. No, you never say that. Nobody says that, not even David Crystal. But there is some coordination, and very commonly there are expressions after verbs like know and guess. I don't know many people who have been affected, or relative clauses there, except you and I. Did you read that column 8 article the other day about this woman who was driving along somewhere in this country road? When I helped. So there is some subordination there in the terms of adverbial clauses and relative clauses. So it's not entirely all joined up. Another feature that we've mentioned but haven't named of spontaneity is the use of heads, what are called heads and tails. Heads and tails are things that go in advance of the sentence, or the utterance if you like, or at the end of the utterance. We saw some examples here. A friend of ours in Paddington, so I'm kind of saying this is the topic. A friend of ours in Paddington, what? They had to move out of the flat. Or the opposite. She was sitting in the room, this old Italian woman. Yeah? So we're sort of going back to name the subject. But this is a slot, if you like, in a spoken utterance which doesn't exist in a written utterance. Somewhere out there with a tarpaulin ready, etc. We saw some other examples. Okay, how are we going? And then we've mentioned already ellipses. Remember ellipses? When you leave out typically the subject of the sentence. And finally, we've mentioned the use of, because it allows you to speak more fluently, the use of formulated language. So expressions like except you and I, or the little old lady over the road. The little old lady over the road is probably an expression the speaker uses a lot. Or the little old lady. It's never the big old lady. Yeah, it's not the little young lady. It's always the little old lady. I don't know what you say in Arabic, but it's always the little old lady. I'm sorry, but it is. And over the road, a lot of these prepositional phrases on the side of the road, in the middle of nowhere, at the end of the day, etc. Very common. Extremely common in spoken language. Not really taught that much, but so important, so useful, those prepositional phrases. Okay, and we can see, I showed this I think yesterday, this kind of the data now that we have from a corpus analysis, Mike McCarthy and co. These are many of the, in spoken language, some of the most common multi-word expressions that you hear in native speaker spoken language. Fair enough, at the end of the day, there you go, makes sense, etc. Now notice some of these are very idiomatic. Maybe not sort of things that you would teach to learners who want to learn to speak English as a global language. Take number 17, to take the mickey. Do you know what take the mickey is? To take the mickey, what is to take the mickey? It's when you, what is it, Jeremy, how would you describe that?
It's when you mock someone.
When you mock someone, when you ridicule someone. Yeah, I'm always taking the mickey out of Jeremy, for example. Listen, this is my workshop. Okay, now, I mentioned also features of interactivity, the fact that conversation is 99% interactive, and even a talk like this, spoken language, it is interactive to a degree. Interactive features, we've mentioned back channeling when listeners show that they're listening but they don't want to interrupt. And the use of vague language, etc., etc. Now this could be a feature of spontaneity, but I can't think exactly what I mean to say. But it also could be a way of showing that it's interpersonal, that you don't want to assert yourself, that you don't want to sort of go into lots of detail, because after all this is conversation. So you just you make it rather vague. Remember, interpersonality is different from interactivity. Interpersonality is creating a good feeling, between the speakers, that kind of social work that's being done. And also playing things down, hedging, using expressions like kind of, sort of, so as not to be too assertive.
Not sure.
And those are very, 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 very common expressions in spoken language. We've seen this, examples of this where somebody completes the utterance or repeats